So I would like to welcome you all to our webinar, Ethnic Studies and the Jews, Current Developments in K through 12 and in the Universities. And it's really our pleasure to be hosting Tammi Rossman-Benjamin this afternoon. AN and AMCHA, the organization that Tammi co-founded and directs, have partnered on a number of occasions over the years. And on a personal note, it's a pleasure to have Tammi as a member of AN and to share her insights with us today, because Tammi and I go way back. And over the years, we've had many a conversation about our mutual interests in combating campus anti-Semitism and strategizing about ways to maintain a healthy campus climate for all. So it's really wonderful, Tammi, to see you again. I wish it could be in person, but we'll have to suffice with Zoom. And I very much look forward to learning from you today on this timely topic. Our webinar is being hosted by AN's recently formed interest group for faculty in California. This interest group has been very active, bringing together our faculty in California to advance our mission and our goals, especially in the context of the issues and the way they impact in the state, in California and in the region and on campuses across the state, as with today's webinar topic. We actually have over 100 members in California, and we're very grateful to Joel Haas, who chairs the group, and for all his efforts and hard work, and for organizing today's webinar. Joel Haas is a distinguished professor of mathematics at UC Davis. He works in computational geometry and topology, the mathematics associated to problems from self-driving cars to automated medical diagnoses. He's been an active AAN member for several years and has been supported by AAN in starting the UC Davis Israel Collaboration in Research Project, which supports new joint projects between Israel and US scholars and researchers. And you can learn more about that project at californiaisrael.org. So thank you so much, Tammi, and thank you, Joel, for all that you've done for AAN and for organizing today's event. And Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miriam, for that very kind word. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tammi Rossman-Benjamin today. Tammi is the co-founder and director of the AMCHA Initiative, a nonprofit organization that investigates, documents, and combats anti-Semitism at institutes of higher education in America. In recent months, the proposed curriculum for ethnic studies in the state of California has received an increasing amount of attention and media coverage. And in this webinar, Tammi will discuss the way that Jews and Israels are presented in the field of ethnic studies, both in California and in the broader United States. I urge you to go check out the AMCHA Initiative at its website, amchainitiative.org. Let me say on a personal note that those of us who are in California universities know that when Israel hatred and anti-Semitism shows itself, Tammi Rossman-Benjamin is among the first to respond. She calls it out for what it is and organizes a response. Through the organization AMCHA, she joins together numerous organizations, over 50, that present a united front against hatred. So before this talk proceeds, let me just say that please submit questions in the chat. There'll be plenty of time for the questions later, and we will end the program formally at 1 o'clock, but Tammi has said she has some extra time, so we should have some time for discussion and further questioning informally after the end of the hour if people have time to stay. So with that, let me turn it over to Tammi. Thank you very much for speaking today.
Thanks for the introduction, Joel, and thanks for the invitation to talk about ethnic studies, which has become a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm going to just turn on my PowerPoint. Let's see. Okay, so the ethnic studies saga in California has lots of moving parts. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to clarify what California ethnic studies issues we're talking about, and to give a bit of the history of these issues and how they relate to the California Jewish community, to explain why our organization, a campus anti-Semitism watchdog group, has opposed them, and to offer some ideas for how to address these issues moving forward. So when we talk about the California ethnic studies issue, we're actually talking about 3 different statewide ethnic studies initiatives. Uh-oh. Just a second. Let me give you a general overview of the terrain, and we'll look then more closely at each initiative and its attendant controversy after that. The first is the state-mandated ethnic studies model curriculum. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, darn. So in 2016, a California bill, AB 2016, mandated that the Department of Education develop and the State Board of Education approve an ethnic studies model curriculum, or ESMC, that school districts may use if they offer ethnic studies classes. In June 2019, when a first draft of the ESMC was released to the public, it met with a firestorm of criticism, particularly from the Jewish community. After a lengthy revision process, the 4th draft of the ESMC was finally officially approved by the State Board of Ed in March of this year. At the same time, as the state was developing and revising the ESMC, state legislators were introducing and promoting bills that would require all students in public and charter high schools to take a 1-semester course in ethnic studies in order to graduate. AB331, which passed through the state legislature but was vetoed by the governor in September 2020, and AB101, which is currently making its way through the state legislature. And finally, the third ethnic studies issue is in the realm of higher education. At the same time as AB 331 was making its way through the state legislature in the first half of 2020, so too was another bill, AB 1460, mandating that all California State University students have to take an ethnic studies course as a graduation requirement. Unlike AB 331, however, AB 1460 was not vetoed by the governor and became law in August 2020, with the requirement kicking in this fall. So these are the 3 statewide ethnic studies initiatives that we're discussing today. First, the development of an ethnic studies model curriculum. Second, the ethnic studies high school requirement. And third, the ethnic studies Cal State graduation requirement. I'd like to look more closely at each one of these initiatives, understand what's problematic about them for Jews, and how these issues have been addressed by the Jewish community in general and by our organization in particular, and where these efforts stand today. So let's start with the K-12 ethnic studies model curriculum, which is how our organization got sucked into this issue. And let me take you through the timeline of events of how the controversy unfolded. So in 2016, the California governor signed into law AB 2016, a bill directing the State Board of Education's Instructional Quality Commission, or IQC, to develop a model curriculum for use in high school ethnic studies courses. It's clear from the bill's language and from the language in its legislative analysis how state legislators understood the subject of ethnic studies and what they believed the goal of an ethnic studies curriculum should be. The bill notes that, quote, 92 languages other than English are spoken throughout the state, and that the goal of ethnic studies classes is to prepare pupils to be global citizens with an appreciation for the contributions of multiple cultures. In other words, when they passed AB 2016, state legislators believed the curriculum they were mandating would be multicultural, non-political, teaching students about the achievements and challenges of many diverse ethnic groups that make up the state and the country. In stark contrast to AB 2016's multicultural, non-politicized approach to ethnic studies, the first draft of the model curriculum, which was released in June of 2019, focused exclusively on 4 core racialized groups: African, Asian, Mexican, Latino, and Native Americans, and a few others favored by the drafters, including Arab Americans. The draft curriculum also sharply diverged from the politically neutral version of ethnic studies in AB 2016 in its promotion of partisan political agendas and activism. For instance, equating capitalism with racism, lionizing violent revolutionary warriors, and advocating for student engagement in tactics of resistance and direct action, such as anti-police protests and anti-Israel boycotts. The most problematic section of the curriculum for the Jewish community was the highly politicized, Palestinian-focused Arab American lesson, which was blatantly anti-Israel, pushed BDS, and included anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish wealth and power. Not surprisingly, the first draft was met with widespread outrage within the California Jewish community. One of the earliest and strongest reactions was from the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, all of whose members signed a letter to the IQC strongly opposing the draft for having quote unquote anti-Jewish bias. The caucus enumerated their problems with the draft, saying, "We cannot support a curriculum that erases the American Jewish experience, fails to discuss anti-Semitism, reinforces negative stereotypes about Jews, and singles out Israel for criticism." Now, it's important to point out that exposing these 4 anti-Jewish aspects of the ESMC and working to correct them by advocating for the inclusion of informational content about Jewish Americans and anti-Semitism, and the exclusion of anti-Jewish stereotypes and anti-Zionism, including BDS promotion. These were the key goals of most of the Jewish communal efforts throughout the entire ESMC revision process. Now, my organization got involved with challenging the first draft shortly after the Jewish Caucus issued its letter, but we took a somewhat different tack based on our different analysis of what was really wrong with the draft. It's not that we didn't see the 4 problems highlighted in the caucus letter. Of course we did, but we saw them as symptoms of a much larger and more essential problem, one that was actually quite familiar to us from our work on college campuses, and that we believed needed to be exposed and addressed as a prerequisite for any meaningful revisions to the ESMC's content. The alarm bell for us was the curriculum's overt ideological framing as expressed in the extensive exposition of the curriculum's approach to ethnic studies found in the draft's introduction, particularly in its guiding principles, which were clearly grounded in a narrow conceptualization of the discipline known as critical ethnic studies. heavily informed by critical race theory and post-colonial theory. The ideological framework of critical ethnic studies divides society into oppressed and oppressor groups based primarily on race and to a lesser extent on indigeneity and class. And as part of its disciplinary mission, promotes political activism to challenge systems of hierarchy and oppression as defined by neo-Marxist ideologies. So when viewed through a critical ethnic studies lens, Jews are perceived as racially privileged oppressors, Israel as a racist apartheid oppressor state, and Zionists as white supremacist supporters of that settler colonial apartheid oppressor state. And students are encouraged to challenge all of these quote unquote oppressors through anti-racist activism that is an essential part of the discipline. Our experience and our studies on university campuses have shown that these anti-Semitic portrayals of Jews, Zionists, and Israel are strongly correlated with the harassment of Jewish and pro-Israel students, including acts of assault, bullying, vandalism, and suppression of speech. And we believed this would inevitably happen in high schools if such a curriculum were to be used throughout the state. But critical ethnic studies is not just bad for Jewish students. We believe the profoundly politicized and coercive nature of the discipline is bad for all students. Unlike other subjects taught in K-12 classrooms, which seek to instruct students in a body of knowledge and provide them with analytical tools to objectively evaluate that knowledge and arrive at their own conclusions, critical ethnic studies starts with a set of foregone conclusions, ideological commitments, and essentialist racialized identities that are forced on students and must be adopted by them without question or debate. We are concerned that students who, for example, reject the racial characterizations of the discipline or other dogmatic ideological values espoused by the curriculum or their teachers, or reject the identities imposed upon them, would be penalized for expressing their views in a critical ethnic studies classroom, or would self-censor their expression for fear of public humiliation. In addition, requiring students to engage in politically directed activism to advance ideologies and values with which they do not agree is nothing short of a coercion of conscience and a form of educational abuse. More ominously, the moral valuation inherent in critical ethnic studies that encourages lionizing the oppressed and demonizing the oppressor directly and substantively harms not just Jewish and pro-Israel students, but any student who, by virtue of his or her race, socioeconomic status, gender, religion, etc., may well find him or herself subject to opprobrium and hostility simply for being a member or a perceived member of an alleged oppressor group. And arguably, even forcing a student to view him or herself as a lionized victim of oppression can lead to emotional or psychological harm for that individual. So it was this highly politicized, coercive, and divisive nature of the critical ethnic studies framing of the first draft curriculum, rather than what was included or excluded in the draft, that we focused on when voicing our concerns to state education officials. We coordinated a series of letters from over 80 civil rights, religious, and education organizations arguing that such a highly politicized and coercive curriculum was not only pedagogically unacceptable, but would directly harm students. We urged officials to address the problem by establishing safeguards for ensuring that this curriculum and all state-sponsored curricula and other instructional materials may never be created or used as tools of political indoctrination that promote hatred and incite harm against any race, religion, group, or individual. Of course, Our letters were just one small part of the massive Jewish response to that first draft. The Legislative Jewish Caucus, virtually every Jewish organization in the state, and almost 20,000 individual members of the community expressed their strong opposition to the draft. And in direct response to the Jewish community's outrage, Governor Newsom apologized for the draft and said it would never see the light of day. And a week or two later, Linda Darling Hammond, the president of the State Board of Ed, announced the current draft curriculum falls short and needs to be substantially redesigned. This, of course, kicked off an ESMC revision process that lasted more than a year and a half and led to 3 more drafts. The first revised draft, the second draft released for public comment in August of 2020, was a partial victory for most of the Jewish communal organizations that had opposed the first draft. The anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist content associated with the first draft ESMC was completely removed, which was largely a result of the removal of the Palestinian-focused Arab American lesson from the curriculum. However, there was still no real treatment of anti-Semitism in the curriculum. And although there was technically a unit dealing with Jewish Americans in a resource appendix, that unit offered an anti-Semitic portrayal of Jews, accusing them of having achieved racial privilege in America by somewhat nefarious means. The third draft was released for public comment last December, and thankfully, the anti-Semitic unit on Jewish Americans was left out of it. And despite a sample lesson on Arab Americans making its way back into the third draft, the blatant anti-Zionist content and BDS promotion in the first draft were kept out of the third draft. Another very positive development for those organizations promoting the inclusion of Jewish content in the ASMC was that alongside the lesson on Arab Americans were 2 lessons on Jewish Americans that had been submitted by Jewish organizations. And one of them also included an extensive discussion of anti-Semitism and 2 modern definitions of it, one from the ADL and the other excerpted from the IRA definition, though none of the IRA definition's examples linking anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism were in the curriculum, nor was anti-Zionism mentioned anywhere else in the draft as something that has a significant negative impact on Jewish Americans. The fourth and final ESMC draft, which was published in March, shortly before the meeting at which the State Board of Ed unanimously approved the draft, was quite similar to the third draft. Most Jewish communal organizations felt that with this fourth draft, they had achieved all of their goals, ensuring the inclusion of Jewish Americans and information about anti-Semitism and the exclusion of blatant anti-Zionism and BDS promotion. From our group's perspective, however, although the content of the curriculum had changed through its various revisions, the critical ethnic studies framework, with its heavy reliance on critical race and post-colonial theories, which portrays Jews and Israel in anti-Semitic ways, that did not change. Besides a few small wording tweaks and rearrangements, the guiding principles of the first draft were almost identical to those in the final State Board of Education approved draft. And at the end of the day, the model curriculum is just that, a model that teachers can draw from and supplement at their discretion to create their own lessons. So even if the ethnic study model curriculum's final content included and excluded exactly what the Jewish community wanted, there is no guarantee that teachers will use the content focusing on Jewish Americans or use it as it was intended by its authors. Or There's no guarantee that anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist content, including BDS promotion, won't find their way back into teachers' lessons. And in fact, given the anti-Semitic critical ethnic studies framework of the ESMC, which was publicly affirmed by the State Board of Ed president and members as really integral, as an integral part of the curriculum when they improved it in March, our organization remains deeply concerned about the final ESMC, and we have been the only Jewish organization to publicly oppose it. However, as I wrote in a recent op-ed in the Jewish Journal, Jewish organizations can agree to disagree about the worthiness of the final draft of the model curriculum because there's a much bigger threat on the horizon that we need to recognize and work together to challenge. That threat has to do with the confluence of two ESMC-related developments. First, the massive campaign launched by the authors of the rejected, overtly anti-Semitic first draft of the ESMC to have their original draft, or an even more extreme version of it, adopted by school districts throughout the state. And the second threat, attempts in the state legislature to establish an ethnic studies high school graduation requirement that would allow schools to use any curriculum approved by their local school boards, including the first draft of the ESMC or something even worse. So I want to look more closely at each of these developments, beginning with the campaign of the ESMC first drafters. Almost immediately after their draft was rejected in August 2019, members of the SBE-appointed Model Curriculum Advisory Committee started an organization called Save California Ethnic Studies and launched a petition demanding that the State Board of Ed adopt their draft. Their petition ultimately garnered more than 25,000 individual signatories and 150 organizations, including the California Teachers Association and United Teachers of Los Angeles, the largest statewide and regional teachers unions, respectively. Also signatories on the petition were the California State University Council on Ethnic Studies, representing ethnic studies departments on all Cal State campuses, and 23 University of California ethnic studies and education departments and teacher training programs. So these are the departments and programs in both state university systems that are responsible for educating and training the vast majority of K-12 ethnic studies teachers in the state. Beginning in April 2020, the Save California Ethnic Studies group began lobbying individual school districts throughout the state to vote on a resolution in support of both their inflammatory curriculum and the work of the, quote, work of the Save California Ethnic Studies Coalition in bringing together the experts to address any issues. And to date, at least 20 districts have adopted the resolution. In the fall of 2020, a few members of the original ESMC drafters, all of them Cal State Ethnic Studies faculty, established the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Institute to further promote the main elements of the rejected first draft, repackaged as a quote-unquote liberated curriculum, as well as to offer school districts their members educational expertise in implementing the liberated curriculum or any ethnic studies curriculum in their schools. While the group has yet to actually unveil their final curriculum, in various webinars promoting their efforts, the Liberated Group's co-founders have made clear that their new curriculum would draw heavily from the anti-Semitic first ESMC draft, retaining its faithful adherence to the principles of critical ethnic studies, which they call authentic ethnic studies. The group's reliance on the first draft is supported by the fact that their website includes a web page entitled Guiding Principles and Values that is almost a word-for-word restatement of the first draft's guiding principles and links to a 19-page glossary that is nearly identical to the glossary contained in the first draft, including the definition of BDS as a global social movement that currently aims to establish freedom for Palestinians living under apartheid conditions, and the definition of liberation that cites BDS as an example of a social movement whose aim is to achieve freedom through equal rights and justice. So at first, the goal of the Liberated group was to continue to push the State Board of Ed to adopt their liberated or authentic curriculum. But after the board's approval in March of the final draft of the ESMC, which the Liberated group roundly condemned as diluted, sterilized, and wholly inauthentic, they went into high gear, developing a plan to push their liberated curriculum and their consulting services for its implementation to school districts throughout the state as a better option than the state-approved ESMC. And 2 weeks ago, at an online Commonwealth Club event featuring members of the Liberated group, the group's leader, Cal State Northridge Chicano Studies professor Teresa Montano said that her group's goal is to ensure that there is a solid, authentic, i.e. liberated ethnic studies program in every single classroom throughout this state and throughout this country. At least in California, the group's aspirations have a fighting chance of succeeding for 2 reasons. First, the Liberated group has already garnered the public support of the California Teachers Association and the United Teachers Los Angeles unions. And it is likely that the group will also have the full support of ethnic studies faculty and departments on all Cal State and UC campuses, which fully embrace the so-called authentic ethnic studies curriculum being peddled by the Liberated group, and see the liberated ethnic studies classrooms as the perfect landing place for the teachers being trained in their critical ethnic studies university programs. The other reason the Liberated group has a fighting chance of bringing their curriculum to every classroom in the state is that if AB100, the Ethnic Studies High School Graduation Requirement Bill, becomes law, and the odds are heavily favoring that it will, the large number of high schools in the state that are not currently offering ethnic studies courses will be forced to do so. And they'll be scrambling to find a curriculum and qualified teachers and help with implementing the new requirement. And of course, the Liberated group is perfectly poised to take advantage of this windfall. So this segues to the second ESMC-related development that threatens Jewish students and the Jewish community, AB100, which is currently making its way through the state legislature. AB100 is the revival of an almost identical bill, AB331, that was first introduced in 2019. Both bills recommend that school districts use the state-approved ESMC as the basis for the required courses. So after the initial draft of the ESMC was so hotly contested, particularly within the Jewish community, and AB331's author, Jose Medina, was a member of the Jewish Caucus and one of the signatories on the letter opposing the first draft. So after things blew up in August 2019, Medina decided to delay the bill by a year and bring it forward for consideration in 2020. Of course, a second draft of the ESMC didn't come out until August of that year, and it too was hotly contested and would need to be substantially revised. Nevertheless, AB 331 passed fairly easily through the state legislature in August, including with the support of the Legislative Jewish Caucus, but only after the caucus had helped to amend the bill with what they called guardrail language that prohibited instruction and materials in ethnic studies classrooms from promoting, quote, bias, bigotry, and discrimination. This language was added to counter claims like those of our own group that courses rooted in critical ethnic studies would indeed promote bias, bigotry, and discrimination. So, despite the ongoing uncertainty and controversy over the ESMC revision process, the addition of guardrail language and the subsequent support of the Jewish caucus ensured that the bill would pass. Now, our organization did not get involved with AB 331 until quite late in the game. It actually wasn't until after we saw that the second draft ESMC was still firmly rooted in critical ethnic studies and contained anti-Semitic portrayals of Jews. And we understood that the bill would also open the door to school districts adopting the even more overtly anti-Semitic first draft of the curriculum that was at that time being vigorously promoted by the Save Ethnic Studies activists, that it really hit us how dangerous AB 331 was. Because it's one thing to offer a critical ethnic studies course that students can take as an elective if they choose. It's quite another thing to force every student in the state to take such a course. We also realized that the so-called guardrail language was simply a restatement of a statute in the California Education Code that's been on the books for decades. And as we have seen from highly politicized critical ethnic studies classes taught at the college level for decades, these so-called guardrails will do nothing to prevent a curriculum steeped in critical ethnic studies, whether it's approved by the SBE or promoted by the liberated group. It will do nothing to prevent them from portraying Jews and Israel in anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist ways and inciting animus and harm towards Jewish students. But by the time we connected all the dots, the bill was already sitting on the governor's desk, awaiting his signature. We were the only group, Jewish or otherwise, that initiated efforts to oppose the bill. And in short order, we organized an 80-group coalition, a letter and a grassroots and media campaign urging the governor to veto AB 331. Our messaging focused on exposing the critical ethnic studies framework of whatever curriculum school districts were likely to adopt, either the state's model curriculum or some other one. Our messaging included showing that critical ethnic studies is a political movement, not an academic discipline, and it's wholly unsuitable for high school classrooms, that it's coercive and tramples on students' educational rights and academic freedom by coercing students to accept a set of political beliefs and engage in political activism to advance those beliefs, and that it's divisive and will incite ethnic bigotry and harm, including anti-Semitism. Oops. To advance those beliefs, we were very surprised, but extremely delighted when the governor not only vetoed AB 331, but wrote in his accompanying message that the reason he wasn't signing the bill was because, in his opinion, the model curriculum still needed revisions, particularly in light of its clear bias. When Assemblymember Medina revived his bill as AB 101 at the beginning of this year, we immediately took a public stand to oppose it. From our perspective, in light of the massive campaign being waged by the Liberated Ethnic Studies Group to bring their liberated curriculum to every classroom in the state, a campaign that is fully supported by the state's higher education ethnic studies establishment and the major teachers unions, with the California Teachers Association actually being a co-sponsor of the bill. It's even more obvious this year than last that if AB 101 becomes law, it will be a disaster for our students. So the bill is currently in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, but the word is that it will sail through the state legislature, largely because legislators believe the ESMC issue is settled and there will be no serious Jewish opposition to the bill. That is precisely why we believe it's essential that the Legislative Jewish Caucus, whose members led the way in successfully opposing the anti-Semitic first draft of the ESMC in 2019, it's essential that they oppose this bill that once again opens the door to that first draft or something even worse. And so we've posted a petition urging the caucus to do just that, and we're asking members of the California Jewish community to sign. Now, in the last few minutes, what I'd like to do is to focus on the new state-mandated ethnic studies requirement on all 23 Cal State campuses. I could really give a whole presentation about this topic, why I believe this state-mandated requirement will be a disaster for the university and profoundly harmful for all Cal State students, especially Jewish students, and what can be done about it. For now, though, I want to give a very brief overview of the history of the requirement and to suggest that even though at first blush it seems quite unrelated to the K-12 ethnic studies issue, this Cal State requirement not only can shed much light on the K-12 saga, it actually is an integral part of that saga. So in 2019, then Assembly member Shirley Weber, a former professor of African American studies at San Diego State University, introduced AB 1460, the Cal State Ethnic Studies Graduation Requirement Bill. Unlike AB 331, which was neutral on the question of what version of ethnic studies should be taught in school classrooms, AB 1460 made it clear that required courses were to be based on the highly politicized, activist-driven version of the discipline brought into the academy with the 1968 Third World Liberation Front strike at San Francisco State University, which now forms the critical ethnic studies framework of courses at San Francisco State and on other CSU campuses. Despite the fact that the bill was vigorously opposed by the Cal State Academic Senate, along with the Cal State trustees, chancellor, and presidents of the 23 campuses, on the grounds that it represents an unacceptable incursion of the state legislature into the academic programming of the university, it was nevertheless passed by the state legislature and signed into law by the governor in August of 2020. Now, it's very revealing that in the first legislative analysis of AB 1460, Assemblymember Weber is quoted as saying, "Unless this bill becomes law, ethnic studies courses will be decimated by Executive Order 1100. Weber was referring to the fact that in 2017, the Cal State Chancellor issued an executive order revising the general education requirements for Cal State students that eliminated the requirement of 6 units of comparative and cultural studies, including ethnic studies courses. So Weber's goal in introducing a bill requiring all students to take a course in critical ethnic studies was, first and foremost, to ensure that ethnic studies faculty and departments would survive. In light of Weber's admission, it's no surprise that there was a significant overlap between the supporters of AB 1460 and AB 331, the high school requirement bill that was being considered by the state legislature at the same time. Weber herself co-introduced AB 331 and was one of its vocal supporters. the California Faculty Association, representing all Cal State faculty, and the Cal State Council on Ethnic Studies, representing ethnic studies departments on all Cal State campuses, were also vocal supporters of AB331. They knew that any statewide high school ethnic studies requirement would rely heavily on Cal State ethnic studies departments to train teachers who would implement the requirement, and at the same time, the bill would provide a steady flow of jobs for the department's graduates. In other words, a combination of the Cal State and high school requirements would not only revitalize ethnic studies at Cal State, it would make ethnic studies one of the most powerful disciplines in the university. Add to that a highly politicized discipline that portrays Jews and Israel in anti-Semitic ways, coerces students to adopt divisive ideologies and racialized identities, and engage in political activism that incite bigotry and target others for harm, and vilifies anyone who challenges the discipline or its practitioners. And it's not hard to see that if AB 101 becomes law, Californians are looking at a perfect storm in high school and college classrooms throughout the state. I am convinced, and if I had more time, I would actually lay out considerable evidence to support my conviction, that all three of the state mandated ethnic studies initiatives we've discussed today come from and ultimately lead back to the fight for ethnic studies at Cal State. And that without addressing the unbridled politicization of the critical ethnic studies discipline at its university source, a politicization that is anathema to the academic mission of the university, it will be impossible to stem the tide of racial and ethnic bigotry that will ensue, including and especially anti-Semitism at all levels of the state's educational system. So thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, first let's thank Tammi for that presentation with a lot of information. And now I'll open it up to questions. There were so many remarks in the chat that I'm not quite sure what order to go in. So let me ask you to raise your hand using the raise hand function, and I'll call on you in the order that you raise your hand, and we'll unmute you so you can, or unmute yourself actually, so you can ask your question. So I see Gary Gilbert has a hand up. So why don't we start with you, Gary?
Okay, hold on. Let me get my camera working here. Sorry, make a few adjustments. Okay, there we go. Tammi, thank you very much for the presentation. That was extremely helpful in laying out very clearly a very long and complex process. The question I have for you is kind of a practical one. In talking to teachers at local schools, what advice would you give, or what advice could I give to them, to teachers whose schools or school districts are adopting or moving towards this kind of liberated curriculum rather than the adopted ESMC? What resources are there available to teachers to try to push back against that? Are there state officials, Department of Education, Superintendent of Schools that they could contact to try to assist them in pushing back against against the liberated curriculum?
You know, that's a good question, and I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer, Gary. You know, I think they're in a pickle. I think we're all in a pickle because in fact, it's the educational establishment that created the mess that we're in and actually support the liberated ethnic studies model curriculum, right? And I truly believe that if it weren't for the Jewish outrage over the first draft of the curriculum, if it weren't for the Jewish Legislative Caucus weighing in and 20,000, outraged citizens weighing in, I firmly believe that that first draft would have been the final draft. So the fact is that at this point, what it looks like to all, to everybody's looking at it, looks like basically the Jewish mainstream groups support the ethnic studies model, the final draft of it, and are not willing to stand up yet against this liberated, either because they don't know about it or they don't feel like they can deal with it. I'm not exactly sure what is stopping them, but I believe that if we can't turn that around and actually stand up and expose what the liberated group is doing, and part of that, I think, is to expose the corruption there, because this is not just about ideology. That's bad enough, except for a lot of people agree with the ideology. But the fact is that these people, the liberated group, and even the Cal State group, it's all self-serving. It's all to build a fiefdom for themselves, or to build their own power, or protect their own jobs, or even line their own pockets with their consulting. The Liberated Ethnic Studies group is a private consulting group that actually gets paid to go into school districts and help them implement their liberated curriculum. So this is very self-serving, and I think we have to continue to expose that would be the best way that we can actually counter this at this point.
Okay, thank you. I'll call on people. I see a few people's hands up. I'll call on you in the order I saw you. So next I see Diane Klein. Go ahead, Diane. Unmute yourself.
Hi. Yep, I'm unmuted and I think visible. I have, through some of my other faculty connections, including through the California Conference of the AAUP, spent a good deal of time with people in California Teachers Association, CSU faculty, as well as UTLA faculty in locally K-12 faculty. And I wonder what your thoughts are, Tammi. Obviously, there are many questions, and I don't mean to monopolize too much. But my own sense in conversations with many of those faculty members about ethnic studies generally is that it is much more about a response to what they perceive as the long-standing marginalization and disrespect of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian communities in the history of California and California education than it is about Jews at all. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the way that Palestine, Israel, and BDS issues are treated is not problematic, or that whether anti-Semitism is included as a form of hatred and bigotry and so on is not important and revealing, etc. But only that my own experience of the motivation of most of these faculty members is about advancing the interests of faculty and students of color against what they perceive as many decades of exclusion, discrimination, and mistreatment. And I think it may be for that reason that many mainstream Jewish organizations side with that, because they share that sensibility. Again, somewhat separately from some of these other issues. I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I mean, I agree that is what is motivating people, and that's a pure motivation, right? But I think that there are different ways to get at that goal. That the way that is proposed, that the problem isn't just to learn about the struggles, to talk about racism and to teach about racism. It's not to learn about. It's to force. That's the problem with critical ethnic studies. That's the problem with critical pedagogy, with critical race theory, etc., is that it is ultimately a coercive, toxic, and abusive I wouldn't even call it a discipline. It really is a religion, or because it's a set of beliefs and practices that must be adhered to. And if you don't adhere to it, you're bad and you'll shut down. That's the part of it that doesn't work in an academic setting. It doesn't work in a K-12 setting either. Like, even more so, it doesn't work in a K-12 setting. And so I think we have to separate the motivation from from the suggested solution to the problem that they're trying to get at. We can all agree that we might disagree about the extent of it, but we can all agree that there shouldn't be racism in America, that we have to fight it, that individuals of color have not gotten a fair shake in lots of situations. And then the question is, how do you address that? And as I tried to point out at the beginning, the way in which the state legislature wanted to address that with a multicultural, non-politicized curriculum is one way to do that a lot of people can sign on to, right? But that's not what the critical ethnic studies people want. So I don't disagree with you, but I think that it's just part of the issue, and we can't conflate the motivation with the solution. We have to have in other words, we have to be able to have a discussion about what are the best ways to address the problems, and not to shut people down because they don't agree with your solution.
So I have next Peter Herman, then Stephen goes off, and then Nancy Copeland. Then Robert.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really, really an excellent, just an excellent presentation. There's a couple of nuances since I am at San Diego State University. I'm part of the CSU. I was very much part of the controversies over AB 1460. But one of the major differences between what's happening in K through 12 and what's happening within the CSU is K through 12, they have to have a giant, they spell everything out. Whereas the ethnic studies curriculum, AB 1460, is actually only a page. It's much broader, it's much looser. And this is going to make policing, if that's the right word, much more difficult, because really it's up to the individual professor what kind of preference they want, what kind of a course they want, what they're going to emphasize, what they're not going to emphasize. Now, one other part, which I just want to assure you of, and this again is restricted to San Diego State, there are faculty, I'm part of a little group, who are very aware of the coercive potential here. And we are listening for what students are going to be saying about this. And if we find out, as frankly we're all expecting, that there is going to be coercion, that if a Jewish student says, well, I think that anti-Semitism should be equal to anti-Black or whatever, if they then have their grade lowered because of that, then there are faculty who are perfectly prepared to publicly step in. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I'm really happy to hear that, and I will be in touch.
Oh, please.
Because I didn't have a chance to talk about what we're doing at Cal State. We've actually have done quite a lot there, but I definitely will be in touch. But what I want to say, because you're all faculty, right? What I want to say is that I really do think that the faculty, that this needs to be addressed in the academic senate. This is really a question. Why shouldn't this be raised in the academic senate as a question? Is it okay? Does academic freedom protect a faculty member to use their academic, to use their positions and classroom in order to promote political propaganda that coerces students, right? Does academic freedom protect political indoctrination? And I think it's a fair question, and I think it would lead to a great discussion, right? Especially in light of this new requirement.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great presentation. I wonder, I've brought this up at a couple of other webinars, but I think a natural ally for you in this work, and for all of us in this work, is to make friends with the equity and inclusion officers at our schools. I've talked to a number of people in this position. There's the diversity position, and now it's morphed into inclusive excellence, equity and inclusion, all that. This is a whole field now, as you all know. The people who I've spoken to who have that job have really old school liberal education values. And in many ways, from my experience, they're not steeped in critical race theory. They've touched on it, it gets touched on in their profession, but they're really not steeped in it and are natural allies for this particular fight. Also, they are, they're elevated on university campuses as being experts on how to manage diverse identities on campus. So that's just a suggestion for everybody to really go in and talk to your equity officers about anti-Semitism and about the issues that Jewish students face, because often they just have no idea and are very sympathetic and willing to go to bat for you.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. That's a great suggestion.
Okay, then the next person in the queue was Robert Katz.
Actually, Al has been holding his hand up for a while.
Oh, sorry, I missed it. Go ahead. Is that right, Al? Some people are holding their hands up physically so they don't move up.
Al, yeah, Al.
Okay. Tammy, terrific. Thank you so much. I want to focus in on the high school level. We have an enormous threat here. The arena has shifted from statewide to 1,000 school districts that operate high schools around California. I have three things to say about this. Number one, how the hell are curriculum decisions made? School by school, district by district. In some cases, I imagine teachers can sneak in stuff, but in other cases, it requires administrative operation. Number two, who is involved from the Jewish community in fighting on this front? I don't think we have an apparatus here. Number three, I want to suggest very strongly that we have a separate session, a separate Zoom session down the road, focusing in on the high school arena, in which we bring in some of the leaders of the major Jewish organizations in the state, the JCRCs and so forth. We need to pin this down. Who's going to do what? We have a big, big, big job here. My sense is that if we can get a hold of this, there will be a lot of support from parents, community by community, in agreeing with what we have to say.
I just want to make I think you asked the questions rhetorically, but I want to answer the first two questions. Not rhetorically. You asked who makes the decisions at the school board level. They do, right? That the individual of the 1,000 school districts that you mentioned, they get to decide what they want. They could or couldn't. They will. I mean, if they have to have a requirement if the bill, let's say AB100 passes, ethnic studies requirement. But what curriculum they use, that's completely up to them. They can use the recommended one. They could not use it. They could use liberated one. So it really is, that's what makes it so important from our perspective to address this problem at the top level and in the legislature or with the governor before it gets to every single district. Because if we have to fight it in 1,000 school districts, we'll never do that. That was my point. Liberated people are so they outman us and outgun us. There's no way we can win this war on 1,000 battlefields. The second question of who in the Jewish community is working on this, AMCHA is the only organization that has so far opposed AB101, and we're looking for allies.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to Robert.
Let me finish up here.
Oh, okay.
Tammy, even if the mandate doesn't succeed, school districts, individual school districts have the discretion to do something in this area. It's still a problem, even without the state legislation.
Right.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Tammy. So I just wanted to tell you a project that Diane Klein, who spoke earlier, and I are working on that's allied with yours is that we've noticed little to no discussion in the legal academy about anti-Semitism from a legal perspective. And so Diane and I are writing a casebook on Jews, anti-Semitism, and the law that we hope will be adopted throughout, at law schools around the country. And for a number of reasons, we think, one, this is just inherently interesting. Two, that this is a elaborate sort of broader discussions about racism that don't include, that have excluded Jews. We think that this will be helpful for teaching non-Jewish students at law schools about anti-Semitism. I think this will also make life safer for Jewish law professors and students, because the word anti-Semitism, even when it exists, most Jews feel it's like it's rude to mention, or it's special pleading to mention. And we think that sort of by making anti-Semitism and the law a subfield of law will just be good for the Jewish community, good for the United States, good for law students, and so forth. There was a question, we are also organizing a conference on anti-Semitism and the law next spring at Indiana University, and I left my email up here so that if people have ideas or context, they can send it to me. We're also looking for a law review to publish the papers that we're calling, and I can post that. And so my question is, do you have any insights for me over here that we can, that we could advance our project with, in learning from you?
I'm not sure what kind of insights you would be looking for, but I'm definitely happy to. I look forward to seeing what you guys are going to write, and I would be, happy to have a discussion by email or offline. But right off the bat, I'm not sure. Like I said, our organization has not focused on sort of what is in and what is out with respect to this issue of anti-Semitism, right? Whether to include a definition of anti-Semitism or not. We've been neutral on that. We just don't have an opinion about that, because as I said, without getting the framework right, if you try to teach anti-Semitism, if you let, for instance, a Jewish Voice for Peace teacher teach anti-Semitism to their students, it's going to come out very wrong, right? So I get nervous about that. I'm always nervous about letting people, about people teaching about Jews or about anti-Semitism who aren't experts in that. Especially if they have a political or an ideological agenda that's different from mine. So, but I'm not sure whether I think that anti-Semitism should actually be part of a curriculum or not.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question and then we'll end it formally, but we'll keep it open for informal discussion for a little longer. So last question to David Siegel.
Well, first of all, Tammy, thank you very much for not only this talk, but your activity over the last several years. Frankly, I think there's nobody who's done more for these things around these topics than you have on a variety of levels. But let me make a couple of observations, and I've shared some emails with you. I think it's one of the reasons that Jewish groups have not been involved with more recently with opposing things is that they're afraid of being portrayed as sore losers in a sense, right? They've gotten all these changes, there's this new curriculum, and wonderful. What they seem to not realize, even though I and Al and others point that out locally, is that there's an incredible discretion on the part of school districts to choose whatever curriculum they want. There seems to be a level of denial around that. That's the first thing. The second thing is I am on the Davis Unified School District Ethnic Studies Curriculum Committee. That said, the process is totally controlled by the administrators. There's probably about 75 or so other members who are self-selected. I find myself in a small minority raising issues of the sort that you are raising. I really believe, and I believe Al said this, with thousands of school districts throughout California, not to mention the state system, that the only way I see this is actually making any sort of inroads is at a central level, either through the legislation or the Jewish Caucus, trying to get Newsom one to our position, because quite frankly, all of these local efforts, which are great, I applaud people for doing them. We're trying to do some of those here, seem to me to be, frankly, with very, very little chance of success, either at the school district level, even at the synagogue level, as I think I've shared with you. So I really do believe that our strategy has to be at a more global California level.
Yep, I agree completely about that. And the first point you made about why Jewish groups are sort of reticent to jump into this, you said that it was because they don't want to look like sore losers. I think they actually don't.
Excuse me, or sore winners, actually.
Well, either way, I think they
Yeah.
don't want to look like racists. And I mean, I think that what the problem is when you try, every time you try, it's unassailable. Critical ethnic studies is unassailable because anybody who assails it is turned into an enemy. So that you can't challenge it. You can't say, well, I'm not sure if I agree with this, because then you are the evil of the ideology, which is a racist. And Jews do not want to look like racists. And I think none of us do. And I think we live in a political moment that's very fraught and difficult for lots of people, but I think especially Jews, because I think that in many ways we are, because of how we're portrayed by the discipline, we're stuck. We are portrayed as racially privileged. And by arguing about a curriculum, we just prove it. We just prove how racially privileged we are, right? We just prove, if we manage to get the governor to veto a bill, well, we've just proved how much power and influence we have, right? So I think that's part of the problem. It's like a catch-22, and it has to do with the nature of this so-called discipline.
Okay, with that, let me call this official program over. Let's thank Tammi again for her